All right, ready to dive in. Today, we're tackling remote work.
That thing we're all figuring out, right?
Exactly. And to help us, we're going deep into the HBR Guide to Remote Work.
A fantastic resource, really practical stuff.
Not just surviving remote work, but like owning it, right? And think of it as a cheat sheet for all those work from home hurdles.
Staying focused, leading teams online, avoiding burnout.
All that good stuff. When I first saw this guide, I thought, oh, another generic to-do list?
Oh, I get it.
But it's way more. It digs into the real struggles, like staying focused when your office is, well, your entire house.
It goes beyond just individual productivity, too. It gets into the human side of things.
Building relationships remotely, dealing with conflict, all of that. It starts with a really interesting intro by Bruce Tulgan about being indispensable when you're remote.
The art of being indispensable.
Yeah. Now, that might sound intense, but he makes a good point. When we're remote, we miss those little cues that help us show our value. You know, those hallway chats that spark amazing ideas?
Gone right.
Exactly. Harder to do remotely. Tulgan calls it the loss of soft data.
And because of that, we have to be more proactive about showing what we bring to the table.
So not just meeting the bare minimum, but going above and beyond.
Precisely. Especially when your boss and colleagues can't see your everyday work.
Out of Tolkien's 5 strategies for this, 2 really stood out to me.
Oh, tell me.
First, knowing when to say no, being strategic with your time and energy. We've all had that experience, right? Remote requests coming from everywhere.
Don't stop.
Focusing on high-impact stuff, not getting bogged down.
Absolutely. Saying no strategically is key.
And the second one that resonated, over-delivering. Like, be that person everyone knows they can count on, even for those tricky multi-team projects.
Makes you indispensable for sure.
Right. Okay, next challenge, and so many of us face this, staying focused when your home is your office.
Ah, yes, the home office conundrum.
Elizabeth Grace Saunders tackles this in Chapter 1. Her advice is all about restructuring your day for remote work success.
Not trying to replicate your office routine, but building a new one that actually works for you at home.
I love that. One of her suggestions is creating meeting-free days or blocks of time. Game changer, honestly.
Oh, yeah, I've tried that.
It's easy to get sucked into those back-to-back virtual meetings, you know?
Totally. No time to actually do the work.
But having dedicated time for focused work, genius. What do you think about that approach? I know some folks thrive on constant interaction.
I need those blocks of uninterrupted time, personally. Otherwise, I get nothing done.
Same. Saunders also talks about shutting down email during those focus times. Seems simple, but...
But such a difference.
Right. There's also this interesting sidebar by Carolyn O'Hara, who studied top performers at a social media company.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Get this. They took 17-minute breaks for every 52 minutes of work. So it's not about grinding nonstop, but about those regular breaks to recharge. Permission slip to step away from the desk more often, I'd say.
Absolutely. Your
Yeah.
brain needs those moments to function at its best.
So we've got focus strategies, but let's be real, boundaries. Huge when your home is your office. Work-life balance gets tricky.
That's Chapter 4. Saunders nails this one.
She emphasizes clear communication with family, friends, anyone you live with about your work schedules.
Not apologizing, but setting clear expectations.
She even gives a script. I'm planning to be on my computer from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. today. Happy to chat at lunch, but otherwise I'll be busy.
Straightforward and effective.
Right. She also highlights a dedicated workspace, even if it's just a corner of a room. Easier said than done for some, though, especially if you've got limited space or, like, kids around.
True. It's a challenge, but even small things help create that mental shift.
Okay, now the nitty-gritty, the tech tools that make remote work possible. Alexandra Samuel covers this in Chapter 2, and she goes beyond the basics.
I love her tech recommendations.
She highlights those tools with unique benefits, like cloud-based calendars for real-time scheduling, essential when you're juggling multiple projects.
Absolutely. Staying organized is key when you don't have that big office calendar staring you in the face.
She also recommends instant messaging for those quick chats that replace those spontaneous office conversations.
Vital for work updates, but also just to feel connected.
That virtual water cooler moment.
Exactly.
And for those who love working from coffee shops, she says, invest in a personal hotspot.
Freedom from bad Wi-Fi. I must have.
Now, this one surprised me. She prefers a wired headset over Bluetooth.
Interesting. I would have thought Bluetooth was more convenient for remote workers.
Right. But she argues it's about reliability. You're on an important call and your Bluetooth decides to die. Not good. Wired headsets are just more dependable.
Makes sense. You can't afford those tech glitches when you're remote.
All right, we're all set up with our tech. But now, the tricky part. Managing those remote relationships, especially with your boss. Keith Ferrazzi tackles this in Chapter 6.
Oh, yeah, this is a big one.
He says building rapport is tougher remotely, so proactive communication and setting clear expectations are key.
He even recommends a virtual contract with your boss.
A virtual contract, what's that?
It's a clear agreement about communication styles, expectations, feedback mechanisms. It even includes a system for delivering against legacy.
Delivering against legacy. I like that. What does that mean exactly?
It's about aligning your work with your boss's long-term goals. Even remotely, you're part of their vision.
So it's not just about checking tasks off a list, but understanding that bigger picture.
Exactly. Being a strategic partner, not just a task completer.
Strategic partner. Got it. Now let's be honest. Even with the best communication, conflict happens. And remote work can make it even trickier.
For sure. It adds another layer of complexity.
Amy Gallo digs into this in Chapter 7, offering advice on resolving conflict remotely.
Important stuff. Things can escalate quickly online.
She brings in insights from Mark Mortensen and Pamela Hines, who talk about how the lack of those in-person cues can lead to misinterpretations. We miss those shared understandings about work styles.
Makes it easy to misread intentions.
Their main point: stop emailing and pick up the phone.
Email lacks those nonverbal cues that help us understand tone and intent.
So when conflict pops up, ditch the email chain and go for a call or video chat.
Exactly. Allows for real-time clarification, and things are less likely to spiral out of control.
Gallo even shares the story about two colleagues, Leah and Irina, whose conflict only got resolved after they switched to video calls. Sometimes you just need to hear the other person's voice.
Or see their face. Totally agree.
Okay, so we've tackled conflict. But back to that proving your worth remotely thing. Elizabeth Grace Saunders returns in Chapter 8 with advice on demonstrating your value remotely.
Love that chapter. She's full of great tips.
Her advice focuses on actions speaking louder than words. Delivering high-quality work, being proactive, all that good stuff.
It's like that saying, dress for the job you want, not the job you have. Even in your PJs, bring your A game.
Exactly. Two of her tips that I found really relevant were do your work and spread positivity.
Oh, those are good ones. Yeah. Tell me more.
Do your work seems obvious, but it's about being that reliable presence, consistently delivering, even amidst all the uncertainty.
Especially now, right? With everything constantly changing.
And spread positivity is about contributing to a positive team morale. Little acts of kindness, humor, those go a long way remotely.
They make a difference when it's easy to feel isolated.
It's about being that ray of sunshine, even through a screen.
I love that analogy.
Okay, new challenge. Starting a new job remotely. It's already tough starting a new job in person, but remotely, you miss all those informal learning moments.
Absolutely. It's a different ballgame.
Art Markman addresses this in Chapter 9, offering advice on starting a new remote job. He says be extra proactive about getting up to speed.
You have to be, right? You're not just picking things up by osmosis anymore.
He suggests scheduling frequent short check-ins with colleagues, like replicating those water cooler conversations.
Oh, I love that. It's like those casual check-ins where you actually learn the most.
He also makes this interesting point about workplace jargon. New remote workers miss out on absorbing that naturally. Those check-ins become crucial for understanding the company culture, the unspoken rules.
It's true. You miss out on so much when you're not immersed in the office environment.
And his final tip for new remote workers: end each day with notes. Tasks, obstacles, unresolved issues.
Helps you stay organized and proactive.
And make sure you're not letting things fall through the cracks. It's like being your own project manager, even when you're new.
I like that. Now, things get a bit more philosophical. In Chapter 11, Sean Aker and Michelle Guilon challenge our whole concept of resilience.
This is where things get interesting. They argue that the traditional tough-it-out view of resilience is outdated, potentially even harmful.
It's not about just pushing through exhaustion anymore.
They share this crazy stat. Overwork and lack of recovery costs the U.S. economy $63.2 billion annually in lost productivity. That's massive.
That's huge. Makes you realize burnout isn't just a personal problem.
Right. Their argument is that true resilience is about recovery, not endurance. They introduce this concept of homeostatic values.
Actions that restore balance and well-being.
Like, you wouldn't run a marathon without stopping to rest, right? You need those moments to keep going.
Perfect analogy.
Okay, so we're rethinking resilience. But let's face it, virtual meetings, they're the core of remote work for a lot of us. And let's be honest, they can be a bit soul-crushing sometimes.
Oh, tell me about it.
Paul Axtell, in Chapter 14, challenges us to rethink how we approach these meetings.
Time to shake things up.
He wants us to move away from those passive check-the-box meetings and create more engaging, purposeful interactions.
Sounds good in theory, but how?
He suggests that meeting leaders identify in advance who they want to hear from on each topic. This ensures diverse perspectives and everyone participates.
I like that. Keeps things focused and inclusive.
And he stresses the importance of communicating clearly how the conversation will flow, setting those expectations up front.
Keeps things organized.
Now, this one surprised me. He says, go slowly. Seems counterintuitive for a meeting, especially a virtual one.
Yeah, you'd think you'd want to get through things quickly.
But his point is that in a virtual setting where we're missing those visual cues, slowing down actually helps with comprehension. It gives people time to process information.
Makes sense. It also creates space for questions and prevents those misunderstandings that can happen so easily online.
So it's about recognizing the limitations of the medium and adjusting our communication style accordingly.
Exactly. Being mindful of the virtual environment.
Okay, we can't talk about virtual meetings without talking about video calls. Love them or hate them, they're here to stay.
They're a staple of remote life for sure.
But are we using them effectively? Joel Schwartzberg tackles this in Chapter 15. He says we need different tactics for video calls than in-person meetings. One tip was surprising. Look at the camera, not the faces on the screen.
That feels so unnatural.
I know, right? It feels weird at first, but he says it creates a stronger sense of connection, makes you appear more engaged.
Like you're making eye contact, even though you're not technically looking directly at them.
Exactly. He also recommends using the chat window strategically, not just for side conversations, but to enhance your presence.
How so?
You can share links, ask questions, show that you're actively listening, even if you're not speaking.
It's another way to compensate for those missing nonverbal cues. Make sure your voice is heard, even in a crowded virtual room.
Exactly. Now let's talk about brainstorming remotely. In Chapter 16, Liana Creamer and Stephen G. Rogelberg argue that traditional brainstorming methods don't always work well virtually.
Because so much of brainstorming is about that spontaneous energy, right? That back and forth.
And you lose that in a virtual setting. Their solution, embrace silence.
Wait, silence? For brainstorming?
I know it sounds counterintuitive, right? But their technique involves individual idea generation before the discussion.
Ah, okay. So you're not trying to replicate that in-person energy, but finding a new way to generate ideas.
Exactly. They suggest using a shared document where everyone can contribute their ideas independently without interruption.
So everyone has time to think through their ideas fully.
Right. And then, once everyone has contributed, you can have a more focused discussion, building on those ideas collaboratively. They also talk about using breakout rooms for smaller group discussions, especially for larger teams.
I love breakout rooms. They make those big meetings much more manageable.
And research shows that smaller groups actually encourage participation from those who might be less likely to speak up in a larger setting. It's a more inclusive approach.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, what about those big strategic conversations that often happen off-site? Can those be replicated virtually?
That's what Bob Frisch, Carrie Green, and Dan Prager explore in Chapter 17, virtual offsites that work. While you can't recreate those in-person retreats perfectly, they say you can create effective virtual alternatives.
I like that reframing.
They recommend focusing on interactivity and engagement. For example, they suggest starting with icebreakers to build connections. They even give an example. Have everyone share personal and professional updates.
A nice way to establish that human connection.
They also emphasize minimizing presentations and maximizing discussion. Pre-reads can be sent beforehand, so the offsite is dedicated to those interactive conversations.
So it's about using that time wisely.
Yeah.
Focusing on what you can't do as easily remotely.
Exactly. And they suggest using breakouts, polls, chat features, all that good stuff to keep people involved and make sure all voices are heard.
Okay, shifting gears now. Let's talk about leadership. What are the essential qualities of a great virtual leader?
What makes someone stand out in that virtual environment?
Right. In Chapter 20, Melissa Raffoni asks 5 key questions that new virtual leaders should ask themselves. Her point is that leading virtually takes a different skill set.
You can't just rely on those in-person leadership tactics. Exactly. Her first question is, am I being strategic enough? It's a reminder that virtual communication requires more planning. We can't rely on those casual office encounters.
You have to be more intentional.
She says, think through your purpose, audience, and desired outcome before every interaction, whether it's a meeting, a quick email, whatever.
Wow, so even those quick messages require more thought.
Absolutely. Clarity is key in a virtual setting. Her second question is, how can I create structure and clarity to make virtual work?
That's a good one. Things can feel so chaotic when you're remote.
Right. She suggests revisiting what worked in the office and asking, does this still make sense in a virtual environment? Maybe you need fewer meetings, shorter meetings, or different ways of communicating to keep everyone on the same page.
It's about adapting and finding what works best in this new context.
Her third question is, how might I reset roles and responsibilities to help people succeed?
That's interesting, recognizing that people have different strengths when it comes to remote work.
Some people thrive in that independent setting, others struggle.
Exactly. She encourages leaders to check in with their team members regularly. Ask, how are things going? What challenges are you facing?
Creating that supportive environment where people feel comfortable asking for help.
Even when they're not physically present. I like that.
Her fourth question is, am I keeping my eye on and communicating about the big picture?
It's easy to lose sight of the big picture when you're caught up in the day-to-day tasks.
Especially remotely when you're not having those informal strategy chats in the hallway.
She encourages leaders to carve out time for strategic thinking, whether it's solo reflection or dedicated sessions with the team.
Making sure you're making progress toward those long-term goals and everyone understands how their work contributes.
And her fifth and final question, what more can I do to strengthen our company culture?
This can be tricky remotely when you don't have those shared experiences.
Right, you miss out on those casual moments that build the culture.
She encourages leaders to find those virtual equivalents, celebrate wins, highlight successes, reinforce the company's values, all those things that contribute to a strong culture, even when you're not physically together.
Absolutely. It's about finding those ways to connect and build those relationships, even when you're not in the same space.
Now let's talk about a challenge that many leaders face, both remotely and in person: motivating their teams.
Getting people excited, engaged, doing their best work.
In Chapter 22, Lindsay McGregor and Neil Doshi offer some really insightful advice on how to motivate teams effectively. They challenge those traditional approaches that rely on external rewards and punishments.
The carrot and stick method.
Exactly. They argue that while those might achieve temporary compliance, they don't cultivate true motivation.
If you're only doing your work to get that bonus or avoid getting in trouble, are you really going to be fully invested?
Right. They say true motivation comes from within. It's about tapping into people's inherent desire to learn, grow, and contribute.
They call it intrinsic motivation.
They identify three key elements of this: play, purpose, and potential.
Tell me more about those.
Play is about finding enjoyment and satisfaction in the work itself. Purpose is about feeling connected to something bigger than yourself, believing your work matters. And potential is about having opportunities for growth, continually learning and expanding your skills.
Sounds like a recipe for a truly engaged and motivated team.
Right. And they offer three key strategies for leaders to cultivate these elements: give people autonomy, provide opportunities for mastery, and foster a sense of purpose.
Empowering people, helping them develop their skills, and making sure they see the value of their work.
Exactly. And it applies to all teams, not just remote ones.
All right, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be back to continue our deep dive into the HBR Guide to Remote Work.
Sounds good. I'm ready for more. I'm ready for more.
So before the break, we were talking about motivating teams. And even the most motivated team needs a break sometimes, right? Especially when you're working remotely. It's easy to get stuck in that work mindset.
Gotta find those moments to connect. Exactly. In Chapter 28, Kudi Shalev talks about alternatives to the traditional virtual happy hour. You know those, right? Where everyone's awkwardly staring at each other on screen.
Oh yeah, I've been to a few of those.
Not exactly the best way to build team spirit. So what does Shalev recommend instead?
Online games.
Games.
Really?
Yeah, he found that certain types of online games can actually be really effective for building relationships and trust within a remote team.
You're kidding. What kind of games are we talking about here?
He suggests complex, collaborative games that require strategic thinking, communication, and teamwork. One example he gives is Factorio, a factory building game.
Okay, that sounds kind of cool, actually.
It forces players to work together and rely on each other's strengths.
So it's not just about playing for fun, but about learning how to collaborate effectively.
Exactly. It's a fun and engaging way to replicate those informal interactions you'd have in the office. All right, I'm sold. I might have to suggest a Factorio Friday with my team. Okay, before we move on, I want to touch on a skill that's so important for success, but it's often overlooked, especially in a remote setting: listening.
Ah, listening. It seems so basic, right? But so many of us struggle with it.
In Chapter 18, Sarah Gershman argues that active listening is crucial for success, both individually and as a team, in a remote environment.
She really emphasizes its importance.
He talks about the Ringelmann effect, which is that tendency to put in less effort when you're part of a larger group. And she says this effect is even stronger in virtual meetings.
Makes sense. It's easy to zone out when you're not physically present.
You're there, but not really there.
Exactly. So she
Yeah.
challenges us to be more conscious about our listening in those virtual meetings. It's not just about passively absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with the speaker and the content.
So how do we do that? How do we become more active listeners?
She offers some great tips. One is to define your value beforehand. What do you want to contribute to this meeting? What do you hope to learn? Having that clear purpose helps you stay focused.
I like that. It gives you a reason to really listen.
Right. She also recommends practicing targeted listening, where you actively seek out the information that's most relevant to your goals.
So it's not just about listening to everything, but about focusing on what's most important to you and your work.
Exactly. And she also suggests summarizing key points throughout the meeting.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I've started doing that, and it really helps me stay engaged and make sure I'm understanding everything.
It also shows the speaker that you're listening and that you value what they're saying.
It's a win-win. Now let's talk about self-care. This is something that's often seen as a luxury, but it's crucial for productivity and well-being, especially when the boundaries between work and personal life are blurred, like they often are when you're working remotely.
It's so easy to let self-care slip when you're working from home.
It really is. You're always just a few steps away from your laptop.
And you feel guilty taking breaks. Like you should always be available.
Exactly. But Aker and Gilon in Chapter 11 challenge that tough-it-out mentality. They argue that true resilience is not about denying our need for rest and recovery, but about embracing it.
It's about understanding that taking care of yourself actually makes you more productive in the long run.
Right. They even share some eye-opening statistics about the costs of burnout, both for individuals and organizations.
Like that statistic about lost productivity. That was pretty shocking.
$63.2 billion annually in the U.S. alone. That's massive. And it shows that burnout isn't just a personal issue, it has a real impact on the bottom line.
Their argument is that this traditional tough-it-out approach, where we push ourselves to the limit and ignore our need for rest and recovery, is ultimately counterproductive.
It's like trying to run a car without ever stopping to refuel.
You're going to burn out eventually.
Exactly. So what's the alternative? What does true resilience look like?
They emphasize the importance of recovery and introduce the concept of homeostatic values. These are actions that help us restore balance and well-being.
So things like spending time in nature, connecting with loved ones, pursuing hobbies, all that good stuff.
It's about being proactive about our well-being and making it a priority, not an afterthought.
So self-care is not selfish, it's essential.
I love that reframing.
Okay.
Let's talk about a specific challenge that many remote workers face: Zoom fatigue.
Ah, yes. The dreaded Zoom fatigue. It's a real thing, and it can be debilitating.
It's that feeling of exhaustion and drain you get after spending hours on video calls.
In Chapter 12, Elizabeth Grace Saunders offers some advice on combating Zoom fatigue and protecting your well-being.
She's got some great tips.
One of her main recommendations is to reduce screen time. Schedule fewer video calls whenever possible, opt for a phone call or an email instead.
Sometimes a simple phone call is all you need.
Exactly. And she also stresses the importance of building in breaks throughout the day. Don't schedule back-to-back video calls. Give yourself some time to disconnect and recharge.
Those breaks are crucial for maintaining focus and energy.
She also makes an interesting point about multitasking during video calls. Even when we think we're being super efficient and getting things done while we're on a call, we're actually losing focus and absorbing less information.
It's an illusion of productivity.
Exactly. So single tasking for the win. Now let's go back to that essential skill we were talking about earlier, listening.
Listening. It's such a simple skill, yet so powerful.
And it's especially important in a remote setting, where communication can be more challenging. In Chapter 18, Sarah Gershman dives deep into this, arguing that active listening is crucial for both individual and team success in a remote environment.
She really drives home that point.
She points out that the Ringelmann effect, the tendency to put in less effort in larger groups, is amplified in virtual meetings. It's so easy to zone out, multitask, and just generally disengage when you're not physically present.
Because you feel less accountable, I guess, like you can just blend into the background.
Exactly. So she challenges us to be more conscious and intentional about our listening in virtual meetings. It's not about passively absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with the speaker and the content.
So how can we do that?
She offers a few great tips. One is to define your value beforehand. Go into the meeting knowing what you hope to contribute or learn. Having that clear purpose helps you stay focused.
That's a great tip. It gives you a reason to really pay attention.
Right. She also suggests practicing targeted listening, where you actively seek out the information that's most relevant to your goals or the task at hand.
So it's not just about listening to everything that's being said, but about focusing on what's most important.
Exactly. And finally, she recommends summarizing key points throughout the meeting. This demonstrates that you're understanding what's being said, helps you retain information, and keeps the conversation focused.
It also shows the speaker that you're actively listening, which can encourage them to be more engaged as well.
It's a win-win. Okay, now let's talk about building relationships and fostering a sense of community in a remote setting. This can be a real challenge when you're not seeing your colleagues face-to-face on a regular basis.
You miss out on those spontaneous conversations, those water cooler moments.
Exactly. But in Chapter 28, Gudi Shalev offers some creative solutions that go beyond those awkward virtual happy hours.
I'm intrigued. What does he suggest?
Online games.
Wait, really? Games for team building? I never would have thought of that.
It might seem counterintuitive, but Shalev found that certain types of online games can be incredibly effective for fostering collaboration, communication, and trust within a remote team.
So we're not talking about solitaire or Candy Crush here.
No, we're talking about complex collaborative games that require strategic thinking and teamwork. One example he gives is Factorio, a factory-building game that forces players to work together and rely on each other's strength.
That sounds like it could be really fun and engaging.
Exactly. It's a great way to replicate those informal interactions and team-building exercises that happen naturally in an office environment.
I love that idea. I'm definitely going to suggest it to my team.
Now, as we start to wrap up our deep dive into the HBR Guide to Remote Work, I want to touch on one more key topic: communication. It's something we've talked about throughout this episode, but it's so essential for remote work success that it deserves its own dedicated attention.
I agree. Communication can make or break a remote team.
In Chapter 25, Erica Dewan and Tomasa Shimura Pre-Music offer some brilliant insights into the nuances of communication in a virtual setting. They point out that it's not just about what we say, but how we say it, especially when we're missing those nonverbal cues that help us interpret tone and intent.
It's so easy for things to get lost in translation when you're communicating primarily through text.
Exactly. They talk about being mindful of our digital body language, things like our responsiveness, tone of voice, the timing of our messages, even our punctuation and use of emojis. Those subtle cues can have a big impact on how our message is received.
It's like we need to develop a whole new set of communication skills for the virtual world.
Right. They also stress the importance of being explicit about our intentions and expectations. So instead of assuming that others will just get it, clearly state what you need and what your desired outcome is.
It takes more effort to communicate effectively in a virtual setting, but it's worth it.
Absolutely. Dewan and Shimura Pre-Music also suggest using a variety of communication channels to suit the situation. Sometimes a quick email is fine, but other times you might need a phone call or video conference for more context or to resolve a complex issue.
It's about choosing the right tool for the job.
They also caution against unconscious bias in written communication. Our choice of words, tone, and even punctuation can unintentionally reveal prejudiced attitudes.
It's a reminder that we need to be extra mindful of how we're coming across, even in those seemingly casual exchanges.
And they emphasize the importance of creating a culture of psychological safety in virtual teams. It's about building trust and encouraging open and honest communication, even when you're not physically together.
It's about making sure everyone feels comfortable speaking up, sharing their ideas, and asking questions, even if they're different or challenging.
And finally, they talk about the importance of making space for those informal interactions that help build relationships and create a sense of community. It's easy to get so focused on the work that you forget to connect on a personal level, but those moments are essential for a healthy team dynamic, especially when you're working remotely.
It's like those water cooler chats or those impromptu coffee breaks where you get to know your colleagues as people, not just as coworkers.
Exactly. And those moments don't always happen naturally in a virtual setting. You have to be more intentional about creating those opportunities.
So schedule a virtual coffee break with your team or play a game of Factorio together. It might seem silly, but those informal connections can make a world of difference in a remote work environment.
Now, let's shift our focus to a topic that can be a bit more challenging: dealing with performance issues in a remote setting. It's never easy to have those difficult conversations, but it can be even trickier when you're not physically present.
It's harder to gauge those subtle cues and to build that rapport when you're not face-to-face.
Exactly. In Chapter 24, Ron Carucci offers some valuable advice on how to manage a remote employee who's struggling to perform. He emphasizes the importance of addressing those performance issues promptly, but doing so with empathy and understanding.
He encourages leaders to look beyond the individual and consider the broader context. He suggests asking three key questions. What's different? What's worse? And what's mine and what's theirs?
I like those questions. They encourage us to take a step back and look at the situation from different angles.
What's different helps us identify any new variables that might be impacting the person's performance. Maybe there have been changes in their work environment, their personal life, or maybe they're struggling to adapt to a remote work setting.
So it's about recognizing that there might be factors outside of their control that are influencing their performance.
Exactly. What's worse? Acknowledges that remote work can often magnify existing organizational weaknesses. Maybe there are inefficient processes, poor communication, or a lack of support systems that are making it harder for people to succeed.
It's like remote work shines a spotlight on those areas where the organization might need to improve.
Right. And the third question, what's mine and what's theirs, encourages leaders to take ownership of their role in the situation. Are we setting clear expectations, providing regular feedback, giving people the resources they need to be successful?
It's about accountability and recognizing that we as leaders might be contributing to the problem.
And even when we're working remotely, those essential management practices are still crucial. We can't let those things slide just because we're not in the same physical space.
Exactly. We need to hold ourselves and our team members accountable, even in a virtual setting. Now let's talk about one of the biggest challenges of managing a remote team: collaborating across different time zones.
Ah, yes, the time zone dilemma. It can be a real logistical nightmare.
It's definitely a challenge. But in Chapter 26, Donna Flynn offers some great advice on managing a team across 5 time zones. Her main point is that everyone should share the burden of scheduling. It's not about the leader dictating times that work for them. It's about finding solutions that are equitable and take everyone's needs into account.
That's so important. It's easy for those of us who are in the majority time zone to forget that others might be joining meetings at odd hours.
Exactly. And she suggests that even if it means some people have to adjust their schedules, it's worth it to schedule consistent meetings. This creates a predictable rhythm for the team and helps everyone feel more connected, even when they're spread across different time zones.
It's about finding that balance between flexibility and consistency.
Right. And she also emphasizes the importance of being mindful of those who are joining remotely, especially when some team members are physically present in the same room.
I've been in those meetings where it feels like there's an in-group and an out-group. And if you're the one on video, you definitely feel like the out-group.
She calls this presence disparity, where those who are physically present tend to dominate the conversation and unintentionally sideline those who are remote.
It can be really isolating and make you feel like your contributions aren't as valued.
So how do we combat this presence disparity? Flynn offers a few strategies. First, she says to be mindful of those visual cues. Make eye contact with those on video, even if it feels a little awkward at first.
It's about acknowledging their presence and making them feel seen, even though you're not in the same room.
Right, and if there's a passionate discussion happening in person, don't be afraid to pause it and explicitly invite those remote participants to share their thoughts.
It's about being intentional about including everyone in the conversation.
And she also suggests experimenting with equalizing presence by having everyone call into the meeting individually, whether it's video or audio. This helps to level the playing field and create a more equitable experience.
I love that idea. It's a simple tweak, but it can make a big difference in how people feel.
So it's all about being mindful, intentional, and finding ways to bridge that gap between those who are physically present and those who are remote. Now let's talk about a topic that's so important for remote work success: leadership. What makes a great virtual leader? Someone who can inspire and guide their team effectively, even when they're not in the same physical space.
It's a different skill set than leading in person, that's for sure.
In Chapter 20, Melissa Raffoni explores this, asking 5 key questions that new virtual leaders should ask themselves. Her main point is that virtual leadership requires a higher level of intentionality, proactivity, and adaptability.
You can't just rely on those old in-person tactics.
Exactly. Her first question is, am I being strategic enough? It's a reminder that virtual communication requires more planning and forethought than in-person communication. We can't just rely on those casual office encounters or those chance run-ins to get our message across or build rapport.
It's about being more deliberate with our communication.
Right. She suggests taking the time to think through your purpose, audience, and desired outcome before every interaction, whether it's a team meeting, a one-on-one check-in, or even an email.
So even those quick messages need more thought.
Absolutely. Clarity and intentionality are key in a virtual setting where messages can easily be misinterpreted or lost in the shuffle. Her second question is, how can I create structure and clarity to make virtual work work?
That's such a good one. Things can feel so chaotic when you're working remotely, especially if there aren't clear guidelines and expectations.
Exactly. She suggests revisiting what worked well in the office and asking whether those same structures and processes still make sense in a virtual environment. Maybe you need fewer meetings, shorter meetings, or different ways to communicate information and make sure everyone's on the same page.
It's about being flexible and adapting to this new way of working.
Her third question is, how might I reset roles and responsibilities to help people succeed?
That's an interesting one. It's about recognizing that what worked for someone in the office might not be the best fit for them in a remote setting.
Some people thrive in the autonomy and flexibility of remote work, while others struggle with isolation and lack of structure.
She encourages leaders to check in with their team members regularly and ask questions like, how are things going? What challenges are you facing? What do you need to be successful?
It's about creating that supportive environment where people feel comfortable asking for help and voicing their concerns, even when they're not physically present.
Her fourth question is, am I keeping my eye on and communicating about the big picture? It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day tasks when you're working remotely, but it's important to remember that we're all working towards a shared goal.
We're all in this together, even if we're not physically in the same space.
She encourages leaders to carve out time for strategic thinking, whether it's blocking time on their calendar for solo reflection or scheduling dedicated strategy sessions with the team.
It's about making sure that even in a virtual setting, you're moving towards those long-term goals, and everyone on the team understands how their work contributes to that overall vision.
Exactly. And her fifth and final question is, what more can I do to strengthen our company culture? This is one that's so easy to overlook when everyone's working remotely, but it's crucial for building a strong and cohesive team.
It's easy to lose sight of the culture when you're not physically together.
Right. You miss out on those casual interactions and shared experiences that help build a strong team spirit. She encourages leaders to find those virtual equivalents, celebrate wins, highlight successes, and reinforce the company's values and mission, even when people aren't physically together.
It's about creating those virtual water cooler moments and finding ways to connect on a human level.
It takes more effort, but it's worth it.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about something that's always a challenge, whether you're leading a remote team or an in-person team: motivating your employees.
Keeping everyone engaged and excited about their work, even when the going gets tough.
In Chapter 22, Lindsay McGregor and Neil Doshi offer some great insights into what really motivates people. They challenge those traditional approaches that rely on external rewards and punishments.
The carrot stick method.
Exactly. And they argue that while those might achieve temporary compliance, they don't foster true intrinsic motivation.
Because if you're only doing your work to get that bonus or avoid getting reprimanded, are you really going to be fully invested?
Right. They say true motivation comes from within. It's about tapping into people's inherent desire to learn, grow, and make a meaningful contribution.
They call it total motivation.
And they identify 3 key elements of this: play, purpose, and potential.
What do those look like in practice?
Play is about finding enjoyment and satisfaction in the work itself. Purpose is about feeling connected to something bigger than yourself, believing that your work matters. And potential is about having opportunities for growth and development, feeling like you're learning and expanding your skills. So as leaders, how do we cultivate those elements?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
McGregor and Doshi suggest 3 key strategies. First, give people autonomy. Let them have a say in how they do their work and empower them to make decisions. Second, provide opportunities for mastery. Help them develop their skills and give them challenging assignments that allow them to grow. And third, foster a sense of purpose. Connect their work to the bigger picture and show them how their contributions make a difference. It's a simple framework, but it's incredibly powerful.
It's about creating an environment where people feel valued, challenged, and connected to something meaningful. And that's a recipe for success, no matter where you're working.
Now, before we move on, I want to touch on a topic that's often overlooked, but it's so essential for remote work success: Listening.
Listening. We talked about this earlier, but it's so important. It's worth revisiting.
In Chapter 18, Sarah Gershman really hammers home this point, arguing that active listening is crucial for both individual and team success in a remote environment.
It's not just about hearing what people are saying. It's about truly understanding their message and responding in a way that shows you're paying attention.
She points out that the Ringelmann effect, which is the tendency to put in less effort when you're part of a larger group, is amplified in virtual meetings.
Because it's so easy to tune out when you're not physically present.
You're there, but not really there.
Right. So she challenges us to be more conscious and intentional about our listening during those virtual meetings. It's not about passively absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with the speaker in the content.
So how do we do that? How do we become more active listeners, especially when it's so easy to get distracted in a virtual setting?
She offers a few great tips. One is to define your value beforehand. Go into the meeting knowing what you hope to contribute or learn from the conversation. Having that clear purpose helps you stay focused.
It gives you a reason to really tune in.
Exactly. She also recommends practicing targeted listening, where you actively seek out the information that's most relevant to your goals or the task at hand.
So it's not just about listening to everything, but about filtering the information and focusing on what's most important to you.
Right. And she also suggests summarizing key points throughout the meeting, either verbally or in the chat. This not only helps you retain information, but it also demonstrates to the speaker that you're listening and understanding their message.
It's a simple but effective way to show that you're engaged in the conversation.
And it can really help to keep the meeting on track and productive. Now, let's talk about one of the biggest challenges of remote work: building and maintaining relationships. When you're not seeing your colleagues face to face on a regular basis, it can be difficult to develop those strong bonds and create that sense of camaraderie and trust.
You miss out on those spontaneous interactions, those casual conversations that help you get to know people on a deeper level.
Exactly. And it's not just about building relationships with your colleagues, it's also about maintaining your own sense of well-being. When you're working remotely, it's easy to feel isolated and disconnected.
You're spending so much time alone, staring at a screen.
It can take a toll on your mental and emotional health.
In Chapter 28, Kudishelev offers some great advice on how to combat those feelings of isolation and build stronger relationships within a remote team. And what's his secret weapon?
Online games. I know, it sounds crazy, right? But hear me out.
Okay, I'm listening.
He's not talking about just any games. He specifically recommends complex, collaborative games that require strategic thinking, communication, and teamwork. Games that force people to work together and rely on each other's strengths.
So it's not about mindlessly zoning out in front of a screen. It's about actively engaging with your colleagues in a fun and challenging way.
Exactly. One example he gives is Factorio, a factory-building game that requires players to coordinate their efforts and communicate effectively in order to succeed.
That sounds like it could be a lot of fun.
It is. And it's a great way to replicate those informal interactions and team-building exercises that happen naturally in an office environment.
I like it. It's a creative solution to a common problem. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a topic that can be tricky to navigate, even in a traditional office setting: managing underperformance. How do you address performance issues effectively when you're dealing with a remote employee?
It's a delicate balance, right? You want to be supportive and understanding, but you also need to hold people accountable for their work.
Exactly. And it can be even trickier when you're not physically present to observe those subtle cues and provide that in-the-moment feedback.
In Chapter 24, Ron Carucci offers some valuable advice on how to manage a remote employee who's struggling to perform. He emphasizes the importance of addressing performance issues promptly, but doing so with empathy and a nuanced understanding of the unique challenges of remote work.
He encourages leaders to look beyond the individual and consider the broader context. He suggests asking 3 key questions: what's different, what's worse, and what's mine, and what's theirs?
I like those questions. They force you to really think about the situation and consider all the factors that might be at play.
What's different helps you identify any new variables that might be impacting the person's performance. Maybe there have been changes in their work environment, their personal circumstances, or they're just having a hard time adjusting to a remote work setting.
So it's about recognizing that their underperformance might not be entirely their fault. There might be external factors at play.
Exactly. What's worse acknowledges that remote work can sometimes amplify existing organizational weaknesses. Maybe there are inefficient processes, poor communication, or a lack of support systems that are making it harder for people to succeed.
It's like remote work is a magnifying glass. highlighting those areas where the organization needs to improve.
Right. And the third question, what's mine and what's theirs, encourages leaders to take ownership of their role in the situation. Are we setting clear expectations? Providing regular feedback? Giving people the resources and support they need to be successful?
It's about being accountable as a leader and recognizing that we might be part of the problem.
And it's about being proactive about addressing those issues and finding solutions that work for everyone. Now, let's talk about something that can be a real headache for remote teams: collaborating across different time zones. When you're spread across the globe, finding a meeting time that works for everyone can feel impossible.
I've been there, trying to schedule a meeting with people in 5 different time zones. It's like a logistical puzzle.
It's definitely a challenge. But in Chapter 26, Donna Flynn offers some great advice on managing a team across 5 time zones. Her main point is that everyone should share the burden of scheduling. It's not about the leader dictating times that work for them. It's about finding solutions that are equitable and take everyone's needs into account.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, and we need to find ways to make it work for everyone, not just those of us who happen to be in the majority time zone.
Exactly. And she suggests that even if it means some people have to adjust their schedules, it's worth it to schedule consistent meetings. This creates a predictable rhythm for the team and helps everyone feel more connected, even when they're spread across different time zones.
So it's a balance between flexibility and consistency. You want to be accommodating to individual needs, but you also want to create a sense of routine and predictability for the team.
Right. And she also emphasizes the importance of being extra mindful of those who are joining remotely, especially in meetings where some team members are physically present in the same room.
It's so easy for those who are physically present to dominate the conversation and unintentionally exclude those who are dialing in remotely.
She calls this presence disparity, and it can make those remote participants feel like their contributions aren't as valued. So how do we combat this presence disparity? Flynn offers a few strategies. First, be mindful of those visual cues. Make eye contact with those on video, even if it feels a little awkward.
It's a simple way to acknowledge their presence and make them feel seen.
Exactly. And if you notice that a side conversation is happening among those who are physically present, pause the discussion and explicitly invite those remote participants to share their thoughts.
It's about being intentional, about creating space for everyone to contribute.
And she also suggests experimenting with equalizing presence by having everyone call into the meeting individually, whether it's via video or audio. This helps to level the playing field and create a more equitable experience for everyone.
I love that idea. It's a simple tweak, but it can make a big difference in how people feel.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears and talk about virtual leadership. What are the essential qualities of a great virtual leader? Someone who can inspire, motivate, and guide their team effectively, even when they're not physically present.
It's a different skill set than traditional in-person leadership, that's for sure.
In Chapter 20, Melissa Raffoni offers some brilliant insights, asking 5 key questions that new virtual leaders should ask themselves. Her main message is that virtual leadership requires a higher level of intentionality, proactivity, and adaptability.
You can't just rely on those old command and control tactics.
Exactly. Those might have worked in the past, but they're not effective in a virtual setting. Her first question is, am I being strategic enough? It's a reminder that virtual communication requires more planning and forethought than in-person communication.
You can't just rely on those casual office encounters or those chance run-ins to get your message across or build rapport.
Right. You have to be more deliberate and intentional with your communication. She suggests taking the time to think through your purpose, audience, and desired outcome before every interaction, whether it's a team meeting, a one-on-one check-in, or even a quick email.
So even those quick messages require more thought.
Absolutely. Clarity and intentionality are key in a virtual setting where messages can easily be misinterpreted or lost in the shuffle.
Her second question is, how can I create structure and clarity to make virtual work? This is a big one. When you're working remotely, it's so easy for things to feel chaotic and disorganized if there aren't clear guidelines, expectations, and communication channels in place.
Exactly. She suggests revisiting what worked well in the office and asking whether those same structures and processes still make sense in a virtual environment. Do you need to have as many meetings? Should those meetings be shorter? What are the most effective ways to communicate information and make sure everyone's on the same page?
It's about being flexible and finding what works best for your team in this new remote setting.
Her third question is, how might I reset roles and responsibilities to help people succeed?
This is all about recognizing that people have different strengths and weaknesses.
Oh.
What works for someone in the office might not work remotely.
Some thrive on that independence, others not so much.
Exactly. She encourages leaders to have regular check-ins with their team members, asking, how are things going? What challenges are you hitting?
Creating that safe space where people feel okay asking for help.
Even when they're not right there in the office. Her fourth question, am I keeping my eye on and communicating about the big picture?
It's so easy to get bogged down in the day-to-day, especially when you're remote.
You could lose sight of the bigger goals.
She suggests leaders make time for strategic thinking, whether it's solo or with the team.
So it's not all about just checking things off the to-do list.
Right. It's about making sure everyone's aligned, that we're all moving in the right direction. And her last question, what more can I do to strengthen our company culture?
That's a tough one remotely when you don't have those natural interactions.
Exactly. Rafoni says leaders need to find ways to celebrate wins, highlight successes, reinforce the company's values, even when everyone's apart.
It's about being intentional, making the effort to build that culture.
Okay, let's talk about a specific challenge that many remote workers face. Zoom fatigue.
Oh yeah, that feeling of exhaustion after back-to-back video calls.
In Chapter 12, Elizabeth Grace Saunders gives us tips for combating Zoom fatigue.
Give me the highlights.
Reduce screen time. Whenever possible, opt for a phone call or email instead.
Sometimes you just don't need that video, right?
Exactly. And schedule those breaks. Don't pack your day with calls.
Give your brain a chance to breathe.
She also mentions that multitasking during video calls, even when we think we're rocking it, can actually make us less focused. We absorb less information.
It's an illusion of productivity.
So single tasking is the way to go. Now, back to a skill we've touched on before, but it's so crucial. Listening.
It seems simple, but it's harder than it looks.
Especially remotely, when you have all those distractions.
In Chapter 18, Sarah Gershman makes a strong case for active listening. She says it's essential for both individual and team success when you're working remotely.
She points out that the Ringelmann effect, that tendency to slack off a bit in larger groups, is amplified in virtual meetings.
You can blend in, right? You're not as visible.
So she challenges us to be more mindful about listening during those virtual meetings. It's about actively engaging with what's being said, not just passively hearing it.
So how can we do that? Be better listeners, I mean.
She suggests defining your value beforehand. Go into the meeting knowing what you want to learn, what you want to contribute. Having that clear purpose keeps you focused.
Makes sense. Gives you a reason to pay attention.
Right. She also recommends targeted listening, actively seeking out the information that's most relevant to your goals.
Not just trying to absorb everything, but being selective.
And she suggests summarizing key points throughout the meeting. It reinforces understanding, shows the speaker you're listening, and keeps things focused.
It's like a little check-in, making sure everyone's on the same page.
Okay, let's talk about building relationships remotely. It's tough when you don't have those natural in-person interactions.
You miss out on those casual conversations, those opportunities to connect.
And in Chapter 28, Kudishelev offers some unique solutions. Forget those awkward virtual happy hours. What does he suggest?
Online games.
Games! You're serious!
Yep. He found that certain types of games can be amazing for building relationships within a remote team.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but not just any game, right?
No, not solitaire or anything. He recommends complex, collaborative games that require strategic thinking, communication, teamwork.
So it's not just about having fun, it's about learning to work together.
Exactly. One example he gives is Factorio, a factory-building game that forces players to coordinate and communicate to succeed.
It's like a virtual team-building exercise. I love that idea.
Right. And it's fun. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the HBR Guide to Remote Work, I think it's safe to say that the key to thriving in this new world of work is about being intentional, proactive, and adaptable.
Absolutely. We have to be more deliberate about how we communicate, how we lead, and how we take care of ourselves. It's not always easy, but it's definitely worth the effort.
And I think this guide has given us some great tools and strategies to help us navigate those challenges and make remote work really work for us.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep thriving in this new world of work.